afternoon and welcome to the CPR-CSH workshop. Usually it is my colleague from CSH who does the honors, but today unfortunately she's unable to join us. So it falls to me to welcome Durba. Durba is currently Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Ashoka University, and today she'll be presenting on little box retail, which is a play on many words, so I'll let her flesh that out. But it essentially revolves around life in an interesting part of India, which is south of the Calcutta metropolis, on the way to the Sundarbans, and it's there that she'll essentially be focusing on the connections between that position and the metropolis, as well as the interactions within these spaces. Her current research, which focuses on informality and space in New Delhi, which is a different space altogether, but for that you'll have to wait until all questions related to the presentation of today are finished. So Durba, the floor is yours. About 45 minutes for your initial presentation roughly, and then it's open season on questions.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Is this on?
Yeah, if you.
Thank you all for attending my talk today. It's a real pleasure for me to be here presenting in India. I recently... Oh, thank you. Thank you all. I recently moved back to India after 17 years in the United States with some back and forth, obviously for field work. I spent about 3 of those 17 years living here, doing field work in West Bengal, etc. I also grew up in New Delhi. So it's a real honor to be back presenting here to an interdisciplinary audience as opposed to sometimes a narrow audience of socio-cultural anthropologists. So I'm really looking forward to feedback and questions, etc. It's a particular honor to be presenting at CPR, and I think you'll see why as I sort of move forward in my talk, but certain ideas and concepts really developed at CPR by faculty here have been indispensable for me to think about my project in broader ways and think about the ways in which the things that I observed in not a small field site, but a very, very long field site, resonate with broader processes that are taking place in India today, particularly around the question of urbanization. So the title of my talk is Little Box Retail, Illegality and Improvised Governance in Small Town India. And obviously the term little box retail is a play on big box retail, right? But it also was resonated with the visuals or the image of these small shops that you see lining highways across India, but also lining cities in India, these really small structures which are, we refer to them often as kirana shops, which sell all kinds of things and really are a very ubiquitous form of commercial and retail space in India. So I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, and as anthropologists we do field work. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I spent 18 months traveling along NH117, National Highway 117, which connects Calcutta to a part of the Sundarbans which is actually very densely habited. And my ethnographic research along NH117 presents a picture of this in-between space between rural and urban, which connects various small towns, various cities, and various villages along the way. And obviously, in order to do ethnography along a site which is this drawn out, 83 kilometers, my ethnography was selective. I've located myself in specific sites, specific towns, locations, particular industries. And it's a fragmented and piecemeal narrative of some of the processes taking place along this highway, but a narrative that's interesting nonetheless, because it points to a different way to look at the relationship between the urban and the rural. And I'm mostly going to show slides and pictures, but I'll read just a very little bit from my paper on this particular section of my research. In my study of a highway 83 kilometers long, I investigate the urban corridor that bridges the city of Calcutta and the countryside, making strategic and necessarily selective and incomplete stops along the way to describe the small firms, small towns, and new forms of work spreading along this long, stretched out field site. Let me provide some context regarding NH117. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Indian state embarked on a series of highway modernization projects, what some have called India's largest infrastructural expansions since the British built the railways over a century before, and the famous Golden Quadrilateral project is included in this. Often, rather than building new highways, the focus of these projects was the four-laning of previously existing two-laned highways, and in some strategic stretches creating high-speed expressways. Yet the highway on which I focus my ethnography, NH117, is an unmodernized highway. By this I mean that it's a highway which has not been four-laned. It continues to be a two-laned highway which is slow-moving and messily weaves its way through the small towns and villages that border it. This is a road which is perched between its slow-moving present and its potential as a national highway which is to one day be modernized, widened, and expanded. It is of some strategic importance because of its proximity to the proposed sites of container terminal ports in Diamondharbour and Kulpi, both of which remain deeply politically contested. Proposals currently exist to four-lane NH117 in sections, but they remain politically contested and have not come to significant fruition. Two observations are worth noting here in my ethnography of NH117. First, that even along the slow-moving highway, highway in India, an urban constellation or corridor is visible. Rural spaces are connected to both Kolkata and smaller towns and are themselves urbanizing through processes which include professional shifts away from agriculture, an increase in consumption practices, and heightened building and commercial activity, particularly along the highway itself. Thus, even along unmodernized highways, partly as a result of better bus connectivity, many changes are afoot in the Bengali countryside, which possibly orient it more towards an urban sensibility and spatiality. Shumitra Boshak, a contemporary Bengali artist with close ties to rural Bengal, in fact, he is sort of the artist version of me in that he spends a lot of his time traveling between rural and urban, taking pictures, thinking about how the spaces between the village and the city are transforming. This artist created a series of paintings playfully titled Amar Shonar Bangla, My Golden Bengal, which highlight the commercial, built-up and city-like nature of the Bengali countryside, particularly along highways and railway lines. Very far from Rabindranath Tagore's trope of an idyllic and beautiful rural space, Boshak's paintings show worlds of concrete walls emblazoned with ubiquitous underwear advertisements familiar to anyone who travels through the Bengali countryside today. The second observation of significance from focusing on NH117 relates to the role of the state in these transformations of rural and urban spatiality, particularly along this highway. At the risk of overgeneralizing, one might argue that in China the state plays a very central role in locating and developing spaces in the countryside which are to be urbanized and modernized through infrastructural projects and planned new cities, leading to phenomena as diverse as China's eco-cities as well as its ghost cities. In India, the state certainly has made similar attempts to control and accelerate the rate of urban transformations in the countryside, through massive infrastructural expansions such as highway modernization, land acquisition for urban development projects and for special economic zones, and most recently through its urban missions. Often these projects are resisted and contested by farmers and social movements, as in the case of Nondigram and Shingur, and they can be analyzed as neoliberal projects undertaken by the state in the interests of capital, forms of what Harvey terms accumulation by dispossession. And yet, in contemporary India, there are also many spaces that are witnessing processes of urbanization which are not experienced as the imposition of draconian and top-down state plans through forms of accumulation by dispossession, etc. in the countryside. Eric Dennis, Parthu Mukhopadhyay, who's here, Mary Helene Zera refer to these processes as subaltern urbanization, which they define as follows. Subaltern urbanization refers to autonomous growth of settlement agglomerations, which may or may not be denoted urban by the Census of India, that are generated by market and historical forces and which are not dependent on large or traditionally important settlements, which are not planned cities like Chandigarh or Bhubaneswar, which are not industrial towns such as Mithapur, and which are also not directly orchestrated by the state or private corporate enterprises. So these are different than, for example, smart cities, etc. Of course, the involvement of the state cannot be absorbed completely. Example, the improvement of roads and the provision of electricity are all necessary elements in the growth of settlements, but these are usually not spatially directed towards a specific settlement. Others, such as the establishment of a mandi, are more spatially focused but more limited as interventions compared to planned cities. Now, elsewhere in the paper, they note that the term subaltern urbanization can be thought of as a literary device to focus attention on places where urban growth is occurring almost as an unintended consequence of formal state plans. And really, this work was so inspiring to me because along NH117, when I was doing field work and when I came back to analyze what I had seen, I believe that really what I see is a process of subaltern urbanization writ large across a very long space, producing forms of urbanity which are both different from and sometimes an active defiance of the high modernist state plans for these spaces, which involve the widening of the highway and particularly the creation of a port-based special economic zone based around the village of Kulpi, where I did some field work. Forms of subaltern urbanization, contrary to top-down approaches to urbanization in China or the case of large-scale infrastructural projects in India, tend to be informal, localized, and improvised. I demonstrate that along NH117, widespread informality, illegality, and improvised regulation are the norm in terms of governance, spatial arrangements, and new forms of work spreading along the highway. And that's all I'm going to read. But really, I see my work as very much in conversation with the work on subaltern urbanization. It's ethnographic work, so it really does collect and tell stories about the processes which shape these changes in the countryside. And I focused on a variety of sites in my own research. Really, what I do is I examine the private bus industry in southern Bengal. I examine new forms of work which are spreading through the Bengali countryside, particularly the sari embroidery industry. I examine small shops which line the highway across its length, which is the focus of this particular paper. And I also examine types of mobility along this highway. So I made many journeys over the course of my fieldwork and interviewed people while they were in transit between rural and urban space, in addition to in villages and in small towns along the way. So I'm going to start with a series of images. When I started my fieldwork, I perhaps still had somewhere an idea of the inescapable trope almost of the idealized Bengal landscape or Shonar Bangla as what rural Bengal might look like. But when I continued and started traveling across parts of rural Bengal, particularly southern Bengal, I saw what I call a 21st century Bengal roadscape, which is really this mix of urban and rural, which is characterized by new forms of commercial activity, new forms of consumption, and new forms of mobility, particularly obviously along the highway that I studied. And these are just pictures taken along the highway, but they're particularly pictures in this set of the little box retailers that really line this highway at various levels of density from Calcutta till sort of the culmination of the highway in the Bay of Bengal. Note that one of these is a medical clinic. They're of various sizes, scales. Over here, these are pictures taken in Diamondharbour, and this dental clinic that you see on the left is, I talk about informal and illegal structures, and this is also an informal and illegal structure. And really, this landscape this roadscape that I was very interested in examining, I feel Shumitra Boshak was an artist who really was able to capture the story of this space in his series, Amar Shonar Bangla, particularly this kind of the aesthetics of it. What does this space look like when you travel up and down? And the most ubiquitous advertisement that you will see across the Bengali countryside is for Lux Cozy, Rupa underwear, etc. It's kind of inescapable in the aesthetics of this experience. And this is, I mentioned the painting by Shumitra Borshak, and this is one of his paintings called Amar Shonar Bangla, and this is, or the Bengal countryside, or My Golden Bengal, and it's a very ironic and playful painting, and this is really what he has come up with when trying to think about a register through which to visually or aesthetically express the same things that he was seeing through his numerous and continuous trips between rural and urban, or in the subaltern urban. Right. And again, you can see the obvious resonances between these two sets of images. Now, I'm going to focus this talk on the town of Diamondharbour. It's a town which is about 43 kilometers from Calcutta. It was an important port town under the British. Its official population is 37,000. Actually, I don't have the latest census figure there. And it's often described as a market town. It's a transport hub where people come from nearby villages to shop. So a lot of people don't really go to the metropolis of Calcutta for their shopping needs, but instead really come to Diamondharbour and see it as a really important market town. This is a picture of the Ganges or the Ganga in Diamondharbour. And I'm going to focus specifically on the small shops that you've seen in the town of Diamondharbour. Over 50% of all businesses in Diamondharbour are squatters. Of all the small shops are informal squatters. And in fact, the informal economy is at the center of the town's economic and social life. These small shops are mostly unauthorized structures, and they're built on land which belongs to the irrigation, railways, or national highways. And in fact, the central marketplace of the town, its most important commercial areas, fall within the right-of-way of the National Highways Authority of India or the relevant federal or local authorities. So a lot of the shops in this central marketplace are all squatters and should not legally exist. Now, in Diamondharbour, starting a shop is primarily a political process which requires patronage and authorization by a political party. Unauthorized shops along NH 117 were divided according to party affiliation. Certain spaces were reserved for CPM patronage and certain under Trinamool. The bulk of my fieldwork took place in 2006, 2007, 2008. Obviously, the scenario underwent a sea change after 2011 with the landmark loss of the left front government and the coming into power of the Trinamool. And as you can see, this picture was taken later. It was taken in 2013. So shops along this highway are openly declaring who they owe their loyalties to, right? So you see BJP flags, Trinamool flags, and CPM flags in the same space. Now, Diamondharbour has a particular predicament. The center of its economic life should not legally exist. But if only legal businesses were allowed to exist, then half of the market town would disappear. It really doesn't have a lot of land bank on which to expand, and it has no tax base, essentially. Now, I spoke to many government and municipal officials, and they told me that the basis of Diamondharbour's tax base is property tax, the rent it receives from shops in the formal municipal market, and the rent it receives from leasing its cement roller to nearby towns and villages, which seemed an almost comical situation, right? This is an image of the Diamondharbour municipality. And so what the Diamondharbour municipality started doing from the 1980s onwards, from 1982 or 1987, depending on which account one goes by, they began to collect a form of an unauthorized or illegal municipal trade tax from all of these unauthorized businesses. And this is their second largest revenue source after property tax, so above the renting of the cement roller and above, in fact, renting the few formal shops that exist in this municipal market complex. And for 2003-2004, the trade tax, as they call it, was rupees 50 to rupees 1,000 per business per month, and it was determined based on the scale and the size of the business. Here's a sample text of a trade license, which I copied exactly, except for obviously the name and address of the business. I am X of Y business. I do not have a trade license of any kind obtained from anywhere. That I want to get a trade license from Diamondharbour municipality. That in future I shall give up my said business plot for any kind of development work of Diamondharbour municipality.
And these licenses are actually kept and filed very, very seriously. So there are ledgers and ledgers and ledgers of these licenses, whatever their legal status may be, right? Now, a term that some lawyers actually introduced to me was this sort of term, these leases, these licenses are 100% be-aini. Ain is obviously law, be-aini means illegal. And what's interesting is that, while the term was used by a few specific people, that 100% be-aini or illegal was the way in which these leases or licenses were described in almost ubiquitously on the ground. So the shop owners of themselves were aware of their illegal status and used that term. Municipality officials used that term. Notary publics who actually notarize these documents called these leases be-aini or illegal and called the shops themselves illegal. Lawyers in the municipal court, the subdivisional officer, a former district court judge, and several professors at the National University of Juridical Sciences actually described these leases and their structures as illegal. I had a long interview with a former district court judge and who was currently a professor at the National University of Juridical Sciences in Calcutta, and he stated that the affidavit creates no right whatsoever in favor of the shop owner. The municipality creates such worthless documents only in order to make money and strengthen this own hand, and continue to discuss this as an example of corruption. And there was a great deal of derision for this practice. It was really viewed in a very negative light, right? But one of the things that we have to ask is whether this is a form of corruption or whether it's a form of governance in a situation which is a very, very difficult situation. The municipality gets revenue, and it gets also the basis of political support for the ruling party. And through these leases and this sort of proto-legality, these unauthorized businesses use the documents to receive an electricity connection. They feel like they get a measure of legitimacy from the municipality. They do not object to the tax, and they don't really view it as harassment or hafta. They see it as a reasonable kind of rent that they should pay for being able to apply their businesses in this town. So I really think that these leases can be read as a form of improvised governance, as an innovative administrative compromise between on-the-ground realities and legal regimes that just can't accommodate them. And what I term improvised governance is not simply an example of corruption, but rather a mediated attempt to govern when illegality is the norm and not the exception. And secondly, I think Diamondharbour is a really interesting place to think with, because there is no way in which you can think of even the owners of most of these small shops as marginal. When we think of people in the informal economy, we tend to think of them as marginal street vendors, pavement dwellers, or in some way not the norm. But in Diamondharbour, actually, the owners of these shops refer to themselves self-consciously as middle class, and actually form a very, very important part of the economy of the town. So there's no overarching formal structure which takes precedence over them, which is one of the things that we might see in a city like Delhi. This is it. This is the center of political, social and economic life in town. So this isn't a space of marginality at all. And that's something to keep in mind when we shift focus from, metropolis to a small town or a census town such as Diamondharbour. Now, what is the actual legal status of these shops, of these leases? What are their rights? And I would say that the actual status would be much more uncertain. The shops certainly do have certain forms of rights to not be evicted, adverse possession. Perhaps a de facto right is created by the trade licenses. I spoke to MP Singh, who's a constitutional expert, and his reading of these leases and the rights of these shops was completely different than the local understandings, right? Now, the municipality in these leases has this fourth clause which says that the shops also agree to vacate. So in future, I shall give up my said business plot for any kind of development work of the Diamondharbour municipality. So what would this clause of this license or lease then entail should these cases ever come to court, right? And a potential legal ruling or a jurisprudential reading would at least say that this is unclear, this isn't black and white, right? But everybody in Diamondharbour refers to these spaces and these shops and these leases as almost unproblematically be-aini. And I'm trying to think through this, and I would love to receive a lot of feedback on this, because it's very strange to live in a small town where people refer to the most mundane activities as illegal. So buying sort of fruits from the street vendor, the small shop where they sell fruits is illegal. Going and buying notebooks is seen as illegal. These structures are seen as illegal, and the term that's used is illegal, is beaini. There isn't a real conversation about whether these shops have de facto rights, whether they have any form of security of tenure. They're just read in many ways as illegal. And I saw this in Delhi too with the little bit of work that I've done here. And what I argue is that people in contravention of formal property laws are acutely aware of this contravention, and they often take on this heavy label of auto-illegality when describing themselves in their everyday life. And you really see a local discourse of corruption and illegality when people describe very, very mundane activities, right? And one of the things that this demonstrates is that people in Diamondharbour seem to think of the law as a very top-down, unflexible, and unnuanced entity. So once you violate the law, you build your shop on National Highways land, you're always illegal, right? One exists in almost eternal violation of it. And they have ascribed to these shops an almost permanent aura of auto-illegality, even when a jurisprudential or a legal reading would be much more complex, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about when it comes to how people experience these forms of informality, improvised governance themselves. How do they see themselves within that? Now, in the absence or the space of legal uncertainty, you see the need for strong political affiliations. And people who own these shop owners really believe that their status is protected by political parties, not the law. So the conversation is always about what the party will allow and not allow, not about do we have de facto rights, will adverse possession apply, we've been paying a trade tax, etc., etc. It's really invoking the party in terms of any conversation about whether NH 117 will be widened and what their vulnerability to eviction is. Now, this is sort of an aside, and I don't really focus on this in my research, but one of the things that's interesting to think about is that, when we talk about the entry of foreign direct investment and big box retail as opposed to little box retail in India, the debate often focuses on competition, right? Will the small kirana shop be able to compete with the big supermarket? But the entry of big box retail involves not just the challenge of greater competition, but also the risk of widespread eviction given the tenuous legal status of many of these types of shops. So if you think about Diamondharbour as one case, but really NH 117 is lined with shops of this kind at varying densities. So, and it's not that it tapers off, but in fact it sort of tapers off, picks up when you come to another small town, then becomes more sparse in rural areas. But you really do see this as a very dominant retail form. In fact, the retail form. There is nothing else outside of this. This is the center of a lot of commercial life across the entire highway. So people who work along the highway, for example, people who, medical representatives who supply drugs to pharmacies across this highway have told me that they estimate that 60% to 70% of shops in these areas are all illegal, that they work according to these same logics, right? So if we are a nation of little box retailers, across India you see millions of these types of retailers which are unauthorized structures and which often squat on government land. And the state has the power to remove them if desired by selectively enforcing the law, right? And really protection is seen, at least by people who run these shops in the cases that I saw, as being offered by political ordering and not the law. And therefore you see a strong FDI element in parts of these political parties, and they're not in consensus about this at all. The TMC, the CPM, the BJP, the AAP, and their splits, based on how much support they receive again from these very, very small scale kirana shop owners, little box retailers, etc. So the question is, what is the future of these shops, right? Given their tenuous legal status, given the kind of way in which we're perched on a future where FDI and retail might happen, highway widening might happen, even in this particular highway, what is to happen and where will these shops go in many cases? Now, legal theorist Georgia Agamben, drawing on Carl Schmitt, has argued that sovereignty resides in the ability to decide the exception. That is, the sovereign decides when the rule of law can be suspended. But I argue in the case of India, this is almost reversed. In a world of exceptions where most things are informal or illegal or in a gray zone between legal and illegal, sovereignty resides really in deciding when the rule of law can be selectively applied, right? So for the shop owners along this highway, they're always wondering when they will be evicted if the highway is widened, when will the actual norm be selectively applied in a world of exception. And I think that's something really interesting to think with when we think about the possibilities and futures for these vibrant roadside marketplaces. And that's all I have. Thank you.
It's a lot of questions and a lot of structures, so floor is open. But do you also want to tell us a little bit about the transport issue that you spoke about? But in some senses, I'm just curious as to how much of this activity that you see in Diamondharbour is about people who sort of come in from different places. It's sort of like a hub kind of story, and the extent to which those processes by which they come are also sort of in a similar state of informality or illegality. The transport system that is sort of brought in, so because there might be a useful complement to what you just spoke about, and then we'll sort of open up the floor for questions.
Absolutely. That's a great question, because this entire project actually came about through thinking about transport. I initially had a project in the Sundarbans which fell through, and I went to Esplanade, the central bus terminal in Calcutta, to see what type of connectivity was available between the place where I wanted to go to, and I found that there were buses every 15 minutes running throughout the day, right? And these were all private buses, or most of them were private buses, and really the beginnings of this project were thinking about how this explosion in bus connectivity, which everyone along the highway identifies as taking place after 1989, in the early 90s, has affected, changed, transformed, in some way touched upon these spaces. And there's a strong link between the explosion of bus connectivity between these spaces and how they're growing, how they're urbanizing, the commercial activity that's happening in these towns. And this is really the result of the liberalization of transportation policies, where routes which were earlier reserved for state buses were now opened up to private competition. And you have in southern Bengal in this area, you have about 5,700 buses with something like 4,800 owners. So the average holdings of the buses, the firms that hold private buses which ply these areas, are also extremely small forms of informal business, right? And so that they mirror each other, but also, of course, van rickshaws. Does everyone know what a van rickshaw looks like? So sort of a cycle rickshaw has a flat platform behind it instead of the seating for two people, and these are also constantly plying in these areas. Cycle rickshaws, van rickshaws, some motorized van rickshaws where you'll have a moped or a motorcycle attached to that platform. These are all forms of informal transport which have contributed to making Diamondharbour much more of a hub and a market town than it used to be in even the mid-80s. So you see this exponential growth, right? And most of these transportation arrangements are informal or illegal, except for the buses, where in most cases the bus owners are not informal. They actually have route permits, etc. They're able to legally ply these routes, but they're extremely small. So they're very, very, very small firms. And the average bus to owner ratio is something like 1.17. So one bus per owner is really the norm in this area too. So there's a distinct mirroring between the two. And when I was traveling along buses in this route, that's where I found these new forms of work that were spreading along this highway. So really you see the sari embroidery industry, which I study in some detail, spreading now in a form of domestic industry, putting out or decentralized production, spreading from parts of Kolkata where you have the wholesale market to embroidering work being done in a putting out system, all the way to Bokhali, which is at the very bottom, Shagodeep, where I went a few times. People are embroidering saris for consumption across India, actually, and sending them back to wholesale markets in Calcutta along these lines of connectivity. And buses play a key role in this whole system. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have just a few questions. The first is that you said that a lot of these little box retails are on the national highway lands. So what is the position of the landowner about this system?
The position of the landowner. Sure.
The second is, what is the status of the money collected? Can it be immediately used for public investment by the municipality or not? And the last one is, as you said, it's strongly linked to political patronage. So what happened, what are the links between the time of politics and the landscape of these little box retails? What happened when there is a big political change, for instance? Thank you very much.
So we can take a few questions and then you can put them all together. Go ahead.
One thing that was also interesting, when there was change from CPM to Trinamool, what is that? Secondly, are there Sorry. So first was when there was a change from CPM to Trinamool, what happened, what penalties were imposed, and are there payments made directly to the political parties over and above payments to the municipality? Beyond that, it just seems to me you said that, everything depends on patronage of the political parties, but in many cases the courts have prevented governments from demolishing slums. So it appears to me that the only protection perhaps is not just the political parties, there is an entire legal thing that appears to be there. Finally, how different is this from this new issue of street vendors' rights? The street vendors have been given various rights that they can organize themselves. Does that in any sense apply to little box? Should it apply? Would it require a change in the law?
I wanted to ask you if you, informality in shops take a number of forms. I'm wondering about the actual merchandise and the employees. Are the employees official? Are they casual laborers? Where do they come from? So on. Do they have any rights?
So I'm also interested in knowing from you about how this informality and the illegality that goes with it, how is it different from informality and illegality of informal economy in the cities? Meaning, and especially if, like in cities, it is accompanied by the illegality of their homes also in these spaces, in these in-between worlds.
Sure.
Yeah, great. Right. Yeah, what's the position of the landowner? So I haven't done interviews really with NHAI, with railways, with irrigation, particularly in this area. I've done some upper level interviews with NHAI about the Golden Quadrilateral project, etc. But in general, there is a push to widen and four-lane this highway, which everybody, I think, who is involved in the process on the ground realizes is a very tricky and challenging thing to do. So there's widespread, I think, understanding at each level of governance, whether it's municipal governance, whether it's, the state government, whether it's the federal, that it is hard to move people. When I did interviews with the NHAI about the Golden Quadrilateral project, and the National Highways Authority of India did a very efficient job of sort of four-laning the Golden Quadrilateral. One of the quotes I got from, I think that, sort of forgotten his exact designation, but someone very high up, was that it's very easy to move people in Rajasthan, very easy to move people in Gujarat, very hard to move people in Bihar and West Bengal, forget it. So there is definitely an understanding of the political trickiness of removal and eviction based on the political landscape of different places. The status of money collected, there are two issues. The municipality claims that they use the money as any municipality should to effectively govern for the public good, for various projects which included Diamondharbour as a big picnic hub, so they created a new picnic ground which would improve tourism. They claim that they used it to install more tube wells, better water supplies. So the municipal narrative is that they're using this money for the public good. The public narrative is often that they're taking this money and wasting it in all forms of corrupt and unaccounted for ways. And I didn't really follow the money and attempt to get at any truth of this situation, but these are two conflicting narratives as to what's happening. The big political change is interesting. I went back in 2013 and spent about a week in Diamondharbour, and this is possibly not very different than what happened in West Bengal in general, where the political price was not so extreme for the local level party functionaries if they migrated almost whole scale from the previous left front to the Trinamool, right? So when I used to do fieldwork in 2007, 2008, 2009, the party office was the CPM office, and I tried to avoid that space. I mean, I found it a very intimidating space. I didn't want to be sort of seen as someone who was wandering around asking all kinds of, inappropriate questions, etc. When I went in 2013, there were exactly two people sitting in the party office, which earlier used to be the hub of, political life in that town. One was a very young man who was a musician and was an idealist and really believed in revolution. But he said to me, it's very sad because I'm the only person of my generation here. Everyone else has moved to the TMC, and I might have to move one day too. So there really was, it's as crude as saying, a mass migration to the TMC. And some of the old timers stayed, but they're seen as increasingly being quite irrelevant. And this does mirror in some ways a bigger story, right? So the concomitant larger political picture is that earlier you had a mix. You had a TMC councilman, Panna Lal Haldar, in 2008, even when I was doing field work, but the councillors were divided between the Trinamool Congress and the CPM, and I think one BJP councillor, and now it was all basically mostly TMC councillors. So there was a big change in the makeup of the municipality itself. Are there direct payments to political parties? Yes, there are. So there are various forms of payments to their youth clubs, various types of chanda, various types of... there's initial payment to the political party, which ranges between 1 lakh to 50,000 rupees, 40,000 rupees whenever you set up a new shop. So this was the figure that was told to me, and you pay it basically to their club or youth wing. The courts, so I think that absolutely courts have a huge role to play in preventing slum demolition. I think they've been very important in preventing various types of demolitions from taking place, but I don't think that locally people have a lot of faith in courts to do this. People really seem to think that what will protect them, back them, will be the party. So if you think about the worth that maybe ethnography brings to this conversation or debate, the people's faith in the rule of law, their understanding of law is really not very nuanced. They think that they're illegal. They don't really have a particularly strong sense of the possibility of courts favoring them, and rather they seem to put most of that faith in the political parties themselves. So whenever the question came of highway widening, the answer was that the party will not allow it, or maybe the party will allow it. The party allowed it in Calcutta. So they're aware of Operation Sunshine, for example, which was a large-scale vendor eviction drive in 1996. And so those conversations seem to cohere around the party rather than the legal system. How different is this from street vendor rights, movements for street vendor rights, and should it apply? Right now, the way it's different, I think, is that there aren't large moves for regularization. So sort of there are not a lot of moves in Diamondharbour, at least, to formalize these shops that I know of on the ground. And is regularization or formalization a way forward in these areas? It seems extremely likely, just because there is, I would say, much less even than selective pockets in the city. It's very, very hard to think about evicting or sort of moving or demolishing the main marketplaces of towns such as this. Again, you're not speaking about marginal populations, even economically, politically, etc. In fact, people who own these shops, except for maybe some of the smallest, tend to be people who form, the center of political, economic, and social life. And I mean that really seriously. These aren't petty street vendors. These aren't sort of people who have, who are marginalized in some way. They're not people who are poor, essentially, in the context of the town of Diamondharbour. So that in itself creates a very different political, a very different zone of political possibilities. It's interesting when we talk about evictions, for example, in a city like Delhi. There are not that many moves to evict everybody from Sainik Farms, which is also purportedly illegal, right? It's always sort of the slum area or the area of marginality that can be evicted in some ways. What are the actual mechanisms of the actual merchandise and the process through which these shops work? A lot of them are family owned, so the classic family firm where, there will be sort of 4 or 5 members of the family working in the firm. But the bigger ones are not. They hire salespeople, some of the clothing stores in particular, because this has become a big hub for wedding shopping of a different kind. So Calcutta is a big hub for wedding shopping for people who are maybe better off, but Diamondharbour is a wedding shopping area for people who are, not from exactly the same, they're not exactly the same clientele who would go to Rash Bihari Avenue and the big wedding shopping areas in Calcutta. And so those shops, sari shops, etc., tend to hire salespeople, and as far as I know, they have very few rights. They're not organized in any way. They're not paid particularly, they're not paid well at all, and it's very casual labor again. How is this different than the picture in cities? Illegality of homes, absolutely. So I focused on the shops, but the entire wards, Ward 13, I was told, belongs to irrigation department. The irrigation department and all the houses there are illegal. There are entire areas of the town where all construction is illegal, and it's not a very different picture, which is similar to cities. But there is a way in which it's different than the cities, in the sense that you don't have a veneer of the formal city. By that I mean that, over here we have Lachin's Delhi, we have CPR, we have this veneer of a city which is formal, and then we have the informal city of Delhi, right? But in Diamondharbour, so little of the city is formal, right? It's just really parts of the municipal market. So, yeah, this is really the formal state and a few sort of ancillary places around it. So there isn't, in some ways, it gives lie to the fiction that there is a sort of regulated, ordered formal state, and then there's the informal, which is marginal to it. It's very hard to see these spaces, the people who inhabit these spaces, as in any way marginal. So it kind of changes our lens of thinking about informality a little bit, which is why this is an interesting space to think with. There is no there's no norm. There is obviously a norm, but the norm occupies a very small space. It occupies a very small number of people, and it occupies a very, very small importance in terms of politics, right? So there's a whole formal city in Indian metropolises which interfaces with the informal all the time in thousands of ways. You really don't see that in the same scale here.
Thank you, Partha. I had 2-3 points. Firstly, I was just wondering whether you are overstressing the illegality point between the formal and the informal. Even the formal city would be, as critics of Partha Chatterjee had pointed out, is full of illegality. So this point about illegality is about, and within these spaces which are informal, improvised, you said, and so on, there may be more of the legal, especially say for example the rural is much less illegal. There are no taxes, there are no multiple occupations, or there's no land issues, occupations, etc. Taking over land. So maybe the formal is much more illegal. We need to be a little bit cautious on this contrast that you're making. Second point was about and also the perception of illegality. In my fieldwork in Delhi, here the term would be Gair Kanuni. I don't think the slum dwellers I am talking to would ever use this word. Ki hum Gair Kanuni, they will assert they have their right. In fact, this is the most important cry they make when I ask, what do you want from the state? Ki ise accept karo. There is no notion of illegality in their mind, nor in the new party. I think even in the party discourses, for example, the AAP, maybe even the TMC, as against the Congress, which was playing on this making of illegality and patronizing that and then using it as vote banks. The new parties, there is a shift. So this whole issue of illegality, I would request you have a little rethink on that. Secondly, on this, I found very little rural in you started by saying you're thinking of new ways of looking at rural and urban. The rural was not much present. In fact, I was thinking that Diamondharbour was never rural for a long time. Diamondharbour is a part of Kolkata almost. So that and when we talk of urbanization, etc., instead of being amazed by this arrival of shops and mechanics and repairs, what we should also remember is that this is highly slow pace of urbanization. Still we are just 33% urban as against 50 plus in China, for example, maybe 70% in Malaysia. Similarly, Indian urbanization is rather slow. It's still just 33%. Although the village itself has changed in a big way. The villages are not just agriculture, and the farmer is not just farmer. Farmers are involved, I saw in my fieldwork, in lots of livelihoods simultaneously. So that is another story. But as long as we say that rural is where you have 2/3 people involved in farming in part-time or full-time, that rural itself may be changing, but our urbanization is rather slow. And lastly, on this, you had very little on the ethnic dimension. Who are these shopkeepers? Are they the non-Bengalis, migrants also there? The Hindu-Muslim composition of different kinds of occupations. That would have been very interesting. But of course, I'm asking for too much.
Yeah, I was just curious about 2 points. The first is this name, Diamondharbour. So where does it come from? What's the story behind it? If it's a rural, so yeah. The second point is you mentioned about Be'eni. So this Be'eni, it's a Persian word. So it originates from Arabic, which is for eyes or visibility or order. So does it have anything to do with the traditional Mughal codes and laws, Be'eni? Yeah, just two. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an interesting presentation. I would like to just take forward the discussion with some of the points that have already come up. One are just clarificatory, one set of questions, which is that, for example, when they sign the document, are they also, for example, trading the present stability for future insecurity? When they say that they're okay if it is actually taken, and is there any compensation or anything that is also talked about, and if there are any cases of eviction that have already taken place and how they were responded to? That's one. And I also had this question related to the focus on the term and the translation illegality when Be'eni is used, and whether, say, something like, as he's saying, the visibility, or maybe how it could be called as invisibly operating, or say something like
the idea of regulation or maybe yeah, so I was just asking whether that language and translation would also play as in the whole thing. And when you talk about improvised governance, if you could just like elaborate more in the sense that is it akin to the framework used by Roy when she talks about how ad hocism is there and how informality of state and planning itself becomes central and becomes a norm. So few points in that. Thank you.
Yeah, I have just three short questions, so bear with me. The first one is more methodology. You were talking about your ethnography, and at some point you mentioned that the shopkeepers consider themselves middle class, and so I was interested about it. I just wanted to know what difficulties you found in your research and what challenges were there in this ethnographic work. The second question I have is more on the organization of these little box shopkeepers, and I was wondering if there's any interest for them to organize as a lobby or, dare I say, as a class to, further their interests, maybe against FDIs or, against FDI from big box retailers or towards less precariousness and more stability, right? And yeah, the last short question, you mentioned at the beginning that over 50% of the businesses there were informal. So that leaves a bulk, a big number of market which is formal, which is actually a high number. I mean, in terms of labor in India, I think the formal labor market is about between 7 and 10%. So I mean, that's high compared to the Indian average. So I want to know if you had looked at what the formal market looks like in Diamondharbour, and maybe if you'd like to elaborate on what kind of problems or benefits would come from the formalization.